Welcome to the river that terrified the bravest men of Stalingrad. The one they swore was alive, pulling them under, dragging them away without a trace. They said it waited patient, silent, beneath the black water of the Volga. In the autumn of 1942, when the sky turned to ash and the city screamed from both banks, no man wanted to step into that current. The gunfire they could face, the bombs they could hear. But the river, it devoured without sound. Some said it pulsed at night as if breathing. Others said the bodies that never surfaced were being kept somewhere below, as if the Volga itself was keeping count. And yet every night another wave of men was ordered to cross it, unarmed, half-frozen rowboats packed to breaking, because Stalingrad had to hold, and the river had no mercy for hesitation. September 1942. The wind cut through the smoke, carrying the smell of burnt oil and iron. The city on the western bank was already a graveyard of concrete. Across the water in the shadows of the east, the Red Army was gathering recruits from Siberia, Kazakh laborers, students, who had never fired a rifle. Their boots were soaked, their uniforms stiff with mud, their faces gray from exhaustion and cold. They stood on the banks waiting for boats that never returned. Artillery thundered in the distance, the kind of thunder that rolled through the bones, not the ears. The Volga stretched before them like a wound, wide, dark, endless. A flare rose over the city, white light cutting through the smoke. The Germans had spotted another crossing. Within seconds, Stukas screamed, overhead sirens tearing through the blackness. Machine guns raking the river's surface. The men didn't move, they couldn't, because orders were orders, and orders were death. A voice barked in the dark forward. The first boat pushed off its oars, creaking like bones. One man crossed himself. Another whispered the name of his wife. Someone said quietly, "If the river takes me, tell her I wasn't afraid." But fear was everywhere in their breath, their trembling hands, their eyes darting to the ripples that seemed to move against the current. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Because what you're about to hear isn't legend. It's a record written by men who crossed a river they were told was just water, but felt something alive beneath. They believed the Volga wasn't just swallowing soldiers, it was choosing them. Now imagine it. The moonlight reflecting off oil slicks and blood, the air split by tracers, the river boiling with shrapnel. Imagine rowing into that. The current grabs the boat and twists it sideways. The man in front disappears. The next sees only bubbles. A flare bursts overhead, showing the faces of men who already know they won't make it. Every splash feels wrong, too heavy, too slow. Then a shout, someone yanked from the stern. No explosion, no bullet, just gone. Something pulled him, one survivor wrote later, not down, but away. They called it superstition. They called it exhaustion. But across hundreds of testimonies, the same sentence repeats: the river was hungry. It's easy to dismiss it now, to call it fear or madness. But back then, in that city where every street was death, even reason broke apart. Some officers banned talk of the river taking men. Others secretly crossed themselves before stepping into the boats. By November, it wasn't just a rumor. It was part of the routine. You crossed fast, eyes forward, no looking down. Because if you stared long enough into the dark, you'd swear something was staring back. And yet, every day they crossed. 62nd Army Chuykov's men ferried over in fragments, 30, 50, 100 at a time. The crossings began at dusk and continued until dawn. Out of 10 boats, maybe 6 returned, sometimes less. Each crossing left behind a trail of wreckage that drifted downstream, helmets, rifles, sometimes faces. Still, the orders never changed. Hold the city, reinforce, cross. The Volga had become both lifeline and grave. The Germans on the western bank laughed when they first saw it. "The Russians send men to die in the water," one officer wrote. "We shoot them before they even reach land." But what they didn't understand was that those who made it even a handful fought with the rage of the drowned. The Volga gave them fear, and the fear gave them purpose. By winter, the river froze in sheets. Under the ice, they said the dead were still moving shadows, trapped beneath the surface, faces turned upward. Some swore they heard knocking from below when the wind blew right. No one investigated. No one wanted to. They just crossed again and again under shellfire through the fog until the city became a fortress built on ghosts. That's the story we begin with the river that devoured the brave and the fear no bomb could destroy. October 1942. The Volga River stretched nearly a kilometer across at Stalingrad, its waters black and cold, reflecting the smoke-choked sky. It was no longer merely a river, it had become a lifeline and a graveyard at once. The only connection between the trapped 62nd Army and the supplies, reinforcements, and life-giving materiel of the Soviet interior, it flowed like a dark artery through the heart of a city being torn apart. Night after night, small wooden boats, hastily patched rafts, barges, and military transports slid silently across its surface, carrying ammunition, food medics, and wounded men slicing through the darkness, only in flashes of artillery fire or the brief flare of a German illumination round. The river seemed to breathe, moving with a force that no man could predict, a force that swallowed men, wood, and hope alike. On the western bank, in the temporary docking area of Krasnaya Sloboda, thousands of exhausted soldiers waited. They had marched from Siberia, from the Urals, from every corner of the Soviet Union, and now they stood shoulder to shoulder, half-starved, half-frozen, clutching rifles that had never seen combat, their eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Makeshift medics' stations and supply depots were buried under snow, and the docks were slick with ice and blood. Orders came from the Stalingrad Front Command Cross. Reinforce. Hold the city. Each man knew that once he stepped into a boat, survival was uncertain. Artillery and machine gun fire from the western bank, combined with the icy current and floating debris, made every crossing a gamble with death. The river surface was deceptive. Floating alongside wrecked boats, men could see discarded life jackets, broken rifles, and corpses. Soldiers who had made the attempt hours before now bobbing helplessly in the water. Beneath the surface, a murky membrane of oil silt and mist distorted all shapes. Some claimed they could see shadows moving under the water faces or hands that were not there when seen from the shore. The river is hungry, whispered soldiers. Superstition intertwined with reality. Some officers forbade the talk, others secretly crossed themselves, clutching amulets or muttering prayers before boarding. The eastern bank was a hellscape. Factories reduced to rubble, red October Barakati tractor factory, littered with twisted metal, shattered walls, and burning debris. Red Army reinforcements landed under cover of night, but artillery and sniper fire tore through them almost immediately. Units disintegrated before they could reach streets, scattering into rubble basements and destroyed buildings. Soldiers fought inch by inch for territory that had once been a factory floor, an office, a workshop, now only a tangle of steel beams, rubble, and fire. Every step forward was paid in sweat, blood, and frozen flesh. Above, the Luftwaffe dominated. Ju-87 Stukas and Heinkel. He-111s patrolled continuously, dive-bombing the waterway and strafing the banks. Daylight crossings were suicide. At night, flares fell like a rain of white fire, illuminating the water, showing every splash, every moving shadow, every flailing hand. Soldiers called it the light of death. Every 15 minutes, a vessel overloaded, fragile and desperate, would be obliterated. Survivors clung to floating wreckage, shivering, screaming, silent, praying, and cursing in turns. The environmental hazards compounded human threats. The current pulled at boats, sometimes sideways, sometimes toward unseen debris. Ice formed at the edges, trapping bodies, equipment, and small rafts. Floating barrels, crates, and debris created obstacles, while hypothermia silently crept through limbs and consciousness alike. Soldiers described the sensation of being pulled beneath, not by water alone, but by something beneath, something aware, something alive. Night after night, stories circulated of hands or faces glimpsed below the surface, of whispers heard just above the water. When the wind shifted, a chorus of voices from the drowned, claiming their victims still. Reports from the NKVD and the 62nd Army corroborate these horrors. Between September and November 1942, an estimated 10,000 soldiers and civilians died in the crossings, by gunfire, drowning, or freezing. Some were killed instantly by artillery. Others sank silently beneath splintered boats, their bodies lost to the black current. The river held them, claiming them, shaping the narrative of Stalingrad itself. Even the ice could not protect them. When winter hardened the surface, frozen corpses lay trapped beneath faces, stiff lips, blue eyes staring upward from the riverbed. Yet the crossings continued. Reinforcements, supplies, weapons, and wounded men were ferried relentlessly. The river was the only passage, the only hope for Stalingrad. Every boat launched under artillery fire, and flares navigating floating corpses and wreckage moving under orders that brooked no hesitation. Every man crossing carried the dual burden of duty and fear. The river shaped not only the physical battle, but the psyche of soldiers. It defined heroism, courage, superstition, and the thin line between sanity and panic. Folklore grew with each night. The hungry river became a legend, whispered in tents and basements. Men swore that on nights when the wind shifted, ghostly calls echoed from beneath the ice, voices of comrades, civilians, or something else. Anyone leaning too close was said to be pulled toward the frozen surface, and some never returned. The Volga, a river, a graveyard, and a sentient force, was both the obstacle and the enabler lifeline to the trapped city grave for those who failed its test. The current, the cold, the flares, the fire all merged into a single relentless adversary, shaping the campaign and leaving a mark on every survivor's mind. The Volga was no mere river. It was a living test, a crucible for the 62nd Army, a boundary between survival and oblivion. And yet history reduced it to numbers, reports, and casualty lists. Official Red Army records detail the staggering logistics between September and November 1942. Daily crossings involved hundreds of soldiers packed into wooden boats, barges, and improvised rafts. Each vessel carried 30 to 50 men oarsmen and supplies, ammunition rations, bandages, sometimes rifles for those who had none. Survival depended on speed timing, and a prayer whispered in the freezing dark, because the river, black as soot, had a mind of its own, or so soldiers would later swear. Artillery fire from the western bank never ceased. German units deployed over 150 shells per hour across certain stretches. Every flash of explosion illuminated the water, revealing the flailing shapes of men struggling to stay aboard or clinging to wreckage. Observers later recorded that in some nights, up to 60% of men attempting crossings were lost, either killed by gunfire or drowned in icy currents. Boats splintered under bombardment, oars snapped like twigs, and the river greedily swallowed both living and dead. Some men froze mid-oar, shock or terror gripping them, while others, pulling comrades toward shore, saw the faces of the drowned reflected in the black water mouths, frozen in silent screams. The river was also physically merciless. At nearly 1 kilometer wide, the currents moved unpredictably. Surface speeds reached 3 to 4 kilometers per hour, deeper undercurrents. Twisted boats sideways, sometimes pulling them into debris fields or beneath wreckage that hung invisible under oil-streaked water. Winter temperatures hovered at 5 degrees Celsius in October, dipping below zero in November, rendering hypothermia a constant lethal threat. One medical report documented that soldiers lost consciousness within 5 minutes of immersion, their bodies stiffening while the water pulled them away. Reports of drowned bodies drifting downstream were common, but recovery was nearly impossible. Floating debris, barrels of oil, crates of ammunition, broken wood life jackets, even shattered hulls created a deadly maze. When darkness fell and flares illuminated the river, shadows leapt and twisted across the black surface. Soldiers described the sensation of being watched or pulled beneath by something that was not water alone. Sergeant Ivanov wrote in his journal, "The current gripped my legs as if it knew me, as if it remembered every man who had ever crossed. I kicked and screamed, but it would not let me go." Whether hallucination or natural physics, these stories spread, becoming part of the collective fear and folklore of Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe compounded the river's danger. Ju-87, Stukas dove with precision bombs screaming downward, exploding on or near boats. He-111 bombers strafed crossing points, lighting the night with tracer fire and flares. German records note over 200 sorties targeting the crossings during peak periods, killing hundreds directly. Survivors later recalled the hellish contrast, the water's black serenity beneath the fiery sky, bodies and wreckage illuminated in stark, brief brilliance, screams echoing over ice-cold water, only to vanish into silence again. The air seemed to shimmer with tension. Every breath, every movement, every stroke of an oar counted. Environmental hazards added to the human and tactical threats. Floating debris blocked paths, overturned boats, and trapped the unwary. Ice forming along the edges created sharp, invisible obstacles, slicing oars and limbs alike. Floating barrels of oil coated the water's surface with sheen that reflected flares like broken glass. The river became a labyrinth of death, its geography as lethal as artillery or bombs. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and panic caused men to abandon boats midstream, only to vanish beneath the current. These were the moments that blurred fact and legend. Men claimed they felt hands tug at them from below, glimpsed faces under oil and ice, or heard whispers calling their names. Whether true or imagined, these perceptions were as real to them as the shellfire above. Documentation from the 62nd Army and the NKVD highlights the psychological impact. Night crossings were the most perilous. Reports indicated widespread panic, freezing, and disorientation among men attempting to navigate the dark currents. A political officer noted, "Even seasoned soldiers quivered at the edge. The river had eyes. They felt it judging them. Some cried, some laughed, all cursed under breath. Commanders attempted to maintain order, but chaos was endemic. Boats were overloaded to meet reinforcement quotas. Any hesitation could doom dozens. Calculated precision was required, crossing during pauses in artillery rowing, in the shadows of flares, timing to the rhythm of gunfire. A single misstep and men were gone. Casualty figures alone fail to capture the horror. Over 10,000 soldiers and civilians perished attempting to cross, some killed instantly, others slowly claimed by cold exhaustion or the river's stealth. Corpses, barrels, and crates drifted downstream in an ever-accumulating mass. By November, flotsam formed invisible underwater obstacles unseen until a boat struck or a man's foot snagged. Soldiers referred to the water as a collector of the dead, a force that required not only courage but luck, skill, and endurance. Yet the crossings continued. Reinforcements were essential. Supplies could not wait. Commanders enforced a relentless rhythm, boat after boat, wave after wave, under darkness and fire. Some nights no one returned. Some nights only a handful of men made it across, clutching supplies, dragging wounded, slipping onto the eastern bank to fight again. Each success was temporary, each loss permanent. Survival was measured in seconds, courage in inches, and myth grew from necessity. Folklore and fact intertwined inseparably. Soldiers whispered of the hungry river tales of hands or faces, appearing below the oil sheen of moans, beneath ice of comrades, lost yet somehow calling from the depths. Officers dismissed the stories as hallucination, exhaustion, or superstition. But no one could deny the toll the river exacted. It shaped strategy, dictated timing, and imposed fear upon every crossing. The Volga was alive, a participant in the battle, not merely a stage. Even as winter hardened, the river creating ice thick enough to hold men, the threat persisted. Frozen corpses lay trapped beneath their faces, staring upward, mouths open in silence, eyes fixed eternally on the stars they would never see again. The cold, dark water became a repository of memory and terror, anchoring both the legends whispered by soldiers and the facts recorded in reports. Crossing it was not merely movement. It was confrontation with mortality, with fear, and with the elemental power of nature wedded to war. The Volga River, in every report, in every memoir, in every whispered legend, was simultaneously lifeline and executioner. Data confirms the staggering loss rates, yet those who survived carried the dual memory of heroism and horror. Every man who stepped into the dark water confronted bullets, bombs, frost exhaustion, and myth itself. Those who made it carried supplies, weapons, and morale, but they also carried stories that would grow into the hidden fear of Stalingrad, a force that was at once real and legendary, documented in whispered fact and folklore, eternal and relentless. The river waited, black and merciless, stretching almost a kilometer across Stalingrad, a boundary between life and oblivion. Night had fallen, bringing with it an unnatural silence punctuated only by the distant thunder of artillery and the hiss of German flares. On the western bank, thousands of Red Army soldiers gathered at Krasnaya Sloboda, their breath steaming in the cold, teeth chattering, hands gripping frozen oars. Wooden barges, rafts, patched together with barrels and crates, small military boats, all waited, rocking gently, against the icy current, ready to ferry men, weapons, and supplies across the deadly black water. Every crossing was a wager with death. Every man knew he might never see the eastern bank alive. Sergeant Mikhail Petrov climbed into his boat, the wood creaking under his weight. Around him, soldiers whispered prayers, names of wives, mothers, children, their voices swallowed by the river's roar and the distant artillery. The first wave shoved off. Oars struck the surface with a hollow, urgent rhythm. Waves lapped against the hull, carrying debris oil and the floating remnants of previous crossings, helmets, rifles, life jackets, and corpses. The river was alive in every sense, a current that twisted vessels sideways, a cold that seeped through boots and bones, a weight that seemed to pull men down without warning. Halfway across, flares from German positions illuminated the water in stark white bursts. The surface shimmered with debris and oil, and then the soldiers saw it, pale faces frozen in silence, reflected in the oil-streaked water. Some were twisted mouths open in a scream that made no sound. Others stared with eyes that seemed to follow the living, their gaze unblinking, unyielding. The whispers began faint at first, almost drowned out by the clash of artillery voices, calling names, warning, pleading, mocking. Soldiers froze mid-stroke. Some grabbed at the air, some at their comrades, panic rippling through the boat. A barge ahead exploded, torn apart by a German shell. Men screamed, flailing, some thrown into the icy current. Mikhail swung his oar violently, trying to keep the vessel stable, muscles burning, lungs heaving. Behind him, a young recruit disappeared silently, pulled under by a hand that may have been water, may have been something else. The current snatched him with terrifying precision, leaving only bubbles and the ripple of oil across the surface. Stories whispered among the troops suddenly became tangible. The river was alive, the river was choosing. On the eastern bank, the ruins of the Red October and Barricade factories loomed skeletal fortresses amid the smoke. Reinforcements landed, but before they could take cover, artillery shredded the shoreline, tearing men from rafts and sending others sprawling into mud and rubble. Private Nikolai Kuznetsov stumbled from the river rifle, clutched lungs, burning heart, hammering. A shell exploded nearby, throwing him against twisted steel, scattering debris across the black water. Every movement was a negotiation with death. Every step forward, a gamble. Above, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Ju-87 Stukas dived bombs, slicing the night with screams of metal detonating against barges, or the dark water sending waves that capsized small vessels. He-111 bombers strafed the banks with tracer fire flares, igniting the river in white light, showing every flailing arm, every twisting body, every floating piece of wreckage. Soldiers called it the light of death. Some were frozen, staring at shadows beneath the surface shapes, moving independently, as if alive. The river itself seemed to breathe, to decide whom it would claim, whom it would spare. Small acts of heroism punctuated despair. A 16-year-old recruit dove into the freezing river to rescue a comrade clinging to him as oars and debris pushed them downstream. Another soldier carried a wounded officer across a broken barge, balancing against the ice-coated wood as bombs shattered the air. Every act was ordinary and extraordinary, courage and madness intertwined. Yet for every act, dozens of men were lost, capsized boats, splintered rafts, limbs grabbed by unseen currents, disappearing into black water that had claimed countless lives before. And then the true terror manifested, the ghostly event. As flares flickered, the soldiers glimpsed faces beneath the water, mouths moving silently. Eyes staring, hands rising, reaching, dragging. Some swore the river tugged at their legs, others said they felt hands brush their ankles beneath the oil sheen. Panic erupted. Some men abandoned their oars, clinging to comrades, floating debris, or the shattered wreckage of previous crossings. The whispers grew faint, cries, commands, laughter coming from below, carried by the current, or by hallucination, no one could tell. The river had become sentient, choosing, claiming, punishing. In the chaos, Lieutenant Sergei Ivanov directed survivors from the shore, shouting orders over the din of water artillery and the flares. Men scrambled through rubble, dragging wounded, carrying ammunition, pressing into the ruins of factories that had become defensive fortresses. The streets no longer existed. Only corridors of rubble and fire remained. Every building cleared, every floor secured, was a battle, each meter of progress purchased with immense effort. By midnight, the eastern bank was a maze of bodies, debris, and surviving soldiers. Reinforcements continued to arrive from the river, each boat a new experiment in survival. Some succeeded, some failed. The river pulled relentlessly, at all indifferent, patient, omnipresent. The ice along the edges formed sharp barriers. Debris formed invisible snares beneath the water. Hypothermia lurked silently, and the psychological horror faces in oil hands beneath the surface. Whispers in the wind tested nerves and sanity. By dawn, hundreds had survived. Hundreds more had been claimed. Corpses drifted downstream, tangled in barrels, crates, splintered wood. The river had delivered supplies, reinforcements, and hope, yet it had taken a toll far beyond numbers. Soldiers carried weapons and rations, but also memories, the sensation of hands in the water. Faces in the dark, voices calling from beneath the surface. This was the hidden fear of Stalingrad. Not just artillery, not just bombs, but the river itself, alive, patient, and relentless. Even after the survivors regrouped, whispers persisted. Officers dismissed them, attributing hallucinations to fatigue and cold, but soldiers knew otherwise. The river remembered, it tested, it chose. Every crossing afterward carried the same weight, the fear that the river was watching, judging, selecting. The Volga was lifeline, and executioner, river, and ghost, testifying to courage and demanding tribute from those who dared cross it. By mid-morning, new waves pushed off men rowing with trembling muscles, hearts hammering, eyes darting to shadows beneath the surface. They had witnessed, felt, and survived the ghostly power of the river. Every splash, every ripple, every hand brushing against the hull whispered the same warning: the river devours the brave. The hidden fear endured, etched into memory, legend, and the soul of Stalingrad itself. The river had tested courage. Now the city demanded endurance. By mid-November, the Stalingrad campaign had escalated into a symphony of destruction, chaos, and relentless calculation. On both banks of the Volga, commanders measured every crossing, every shipment of supplies, every reinforcements in cold, unforgiving figures. The 62nd Army was beleaguered, but adaptation and improvisation reshaped the battlefield. The human spirit alone would no longer suffice. Strategy, logistics, and relentless engineering became weapons as potent as rifles or artillery. Fact reports indicate that by November, the Eastern Bank had received over 30,000 troops through night crossings alone. Wooden barges and improvised rafts had increased in size and number, yet losses remained catastrophic, a testament to the river's lethality. Out of the 30 to 50 vessels launching each night, an average of 12 failed to reach the eastern shore. Yet this was the paradox: the survivors, carrying both men and ammunition, became the backbone of Stalingrad's defense. The river devoured, but it also delivered, and those who survived were battle-hardened beyond calculation. The Germans believed control of the Volga was absolute. Luftwaffe patrols launched over 300 sorties, weekly dive-bombing barges, strafing soldiers, illuminating the river with flares that transformed night into a deadly tableau of light and shadow. But the Soviets adapted. Crossing times were recalculated to exploit minimal visibility, rafts were reinforced oars synchronized for efficiency, and deceptive false crossings were staged to distract artillery. Engineers introduced floating barricades, submerged poles, and camouflage nets to shield vessels. Tactical improvisation began to outmaneuver enemy fire. The river's danger persisted, but soldiers learned to cheat the currents, to evade destruction, to survive where before there was only death. Outflanked, outproduced, outsmarted. The Germans' expectation of an easy annihilation of reinforcements failed. Reports from German 6th Army intelligence noted repeated failures to intercept the river traffic. While casualties were high, every successful crossing delivered rifles, grenades, mortars, and food, slowly building a network of resistance within the ruins of Red October barricade and the tractor factory. Supply lines, fragile and fleeting, became arteries of survival, enabling the defenders to hold strategic positions, consolidate units, and organize counterattacks. Onshore survivors became engineers, strategists, and soldiers simultaneously. Barricades were reinforced, sniper nests established, and every floor of a factory converted into a firing position. Reports confirmed that improvised weapons captured rifles, machine guns mounted on rubble. Molotov cocktails were effectively used to counteract German advances. Every inch of ground taken or held was the product of coordination, calculation, and sheer will, amplified by the lessons learned from river crossings. Survival had become tactical. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and artillery were constants, yet the defenders' efficiency improved. Casualty ratios, once catastrophic, began to stabilize. Boats now launched in coordinated waves. Oarsmen rotated to prevent fatigue. Officers monitored river currents, flare timings, and artillery patterns to synchronize movements. Every successful crossing became a reinforcement, not just in manpower, but in psychological advantage. Each survivor emboldened others, proving that the river could be beaten, at least partially. The Volga's treachery remained real. Bodies still floated downstream, ice trapped the dead beneath the surface, and psychological trauma lingered among survivors. Yet juxtaposed against this was an escalation in technical precision. Engineers calculated the optimal weight distribution on rafts, reduced exposure to enemy fire, and implemented signaling methods invisible from the western bank. The river's lethality persisted, but it was no longer absolute. Adaptation had created an edge where before there was only helplessness. Fact reports detail artillery usage on both banks. German guns fired over 150 shells per hour, yet Soviet counter-battery fire increasingly disrupted targeting accuracy. Intelligence officers used intercepted communications to anticipate German patrols and plan crossings accordingly. Night flares remained a hazard, but new timing strategies allowed boats to move in synchronization with artillery lulls. Each successful crossing became a demonstration of methodical, almost mathematical precision, men outsmarting death through numbers, timing, and coordination. The interplay of human ingenuity against natural and man-made threats became the essence of Stalingrad's hidden triumph. Floating supply caches, submerged decoys, and coordinated rowing patterns minimized losses. Every crossing was a microcosm of strategy in action. Reports of floating bodies, debris, and casualties persisted, but officers emphasized the increasing number of men and materiel successfully delivered to the eastern bank. Survival became predictable even if peril remained omnipresent. Amidst this escalation, folklore continued to breathe. Soldiers recounted whispers from beneath the water, glimpses of pale faces, shadows moving under oil and ice, the ghostly echoes of those claimed by the river. Even officers steeped in calculation and reports could not ignore these stories entirely. The line between fact and legend blurred, creating a shared psychological edge. Fear sharpened focus, superstition reinforced discipline, and the river became both threat and ally in shaping human resolve. Casualty statistics, juxtaposed against deliveries, highlight the contrast. While approximately 40% of each crossing might be lost to death, hypothermia, or drowning, the remaining 60% delivered critical reinforcement ammunition and morale to Stalingrad. Enemy expectations of absolute attrition were subverted. In reports, German officers described their frustration. The river devours, yet men continue to arrive. Every night more emerged, defying fire, frost, and logic. The river's horror was undeniable, but human adaptability had tilted the balance, a subtle psychological escalation that turned defeat into survival. Even in the factories, defenders noticed the change. Machine gun nests, anti-tank obstacles, improvised barricades, and coordinated patrols were bolstered by the men who survived crossings. Commanders could now plan limited counterattacks, secure critical positions, and sustain morale despite bombardment. Each successful landing fed not just rifles and rations, but strategy itself. Where the river once dictated fate, it now became a component of it, a deadly partner in a deadly dance. By late November, patterns emerged. Crossings timed with artillery lulls, decoy rafts, reinforced vessels, and synchronized rowing created a measurable improvement in survival rates. Casualty reports, though still grim, showed a notable increase in effective reinforcements. These small but significant improvements demonstrated the 62nd Army's ability to outsmart, outflank, and partially outproduce the enemy, transforming the Volga from a weapon of annihilation into a conduit of calculated survival. Yet the ghostly echoes remained. Faces beneath oil, whispers beneath ice, hands brushing unseen, these psychological shadows persisted alongside every fact layer. Soldiers whispered about the river's sentience, about its memory of the brave lost, and about the subtle forces guiding or condemning men. Every crossing remained perilous, every boat a gamble. But now the narrative had shifted. Survival was possible. Fear was measured. and strategy calculation and adaptation had escalated the human capacity to meet elemental horror with method, precision, and courage. The contrast was stark, the river devoured as before, yet men survived in increasing numbers. Logistics, timing, improvisation, and psychological resilience combined to shift the balance. The hidden fear remained, shadows, voices, and legends persisted, but the tangible reality of survival, of reinforcement, of strategy, had transformed the battlefield. Stalingrad would not fall quietly into the hands of the Sixth Army. Instead, the river that devoured the brave now carried with it the means to resist, to endure, and to shape the course of history. By late November 1942, the river had done its work. Night after night, the Volga had devoured the brave, claimed hundreds of lives, frozen countless more beneath its black, oil-streaked surface, yet it had also delivered the sinews of survival men, rifles, mortars, and hope. Commanders of the 62nd Army, observing the persistence and ingenuity of their forces, recognized a subtle but crucial shift. What once had been sheer desperation was now methodical resilience. The river's terror remained, but it had been tamed, measured, and turned into an instrument of survival. General Vasily Chuikov, standing in a makeshift command bunker overlooking the eastern banks, had witnessed hundreds of crossings in a single night. He had seen boats overturn oars, splinter men vanish beneath currents and ice. He had seen the psychological toll etched on every face, the whispered legends, the silent prayers, the terror that made hardened soldiers shiver. Yet amidst this human cost, he also saw the transformation of fear into strategy, panic into precision. The river had tested his troops and revealed their limits and their capacity to overcome. Reports from his staff detailed hundreds of successfully landed reinforcements, critical ammunition deliveries, and the establishment of fortified positions in the ruins of Red October barricade and the tractor factory. The German Sixth Army, confident in its superior artillery and air dominance, had anticipated absolute attrition. Their calculations, however, failed to account for adaptability under extreme pressure. Though Ju-87 Stukas and Heinkel He-111s continued to patrol the skies, their efforts could not completely halt the crossings. Each night, despite shelling and strafing, new soldiers reached the eastern shore carrying rifles, machine guns, and explosives, reinforcing defensive positions. The Volga remained deadly, but it was no longer absolute. The river that devoured the brave now offered a narrow but reliable path of resistance. Onshore, human determination carved order from chaos. Soldiers who survived crossings reorganized, salvaging weapons from debris, reinforcing barricades, and preparing for the inevitable German advances. Small units executed counterattacks, retaking floors of factories and contested streets. Casualties were immense, yet every successful maneuver was a testament to resilience, calculation, and the strategic use of the river itself. Where panzers, mortars, and rifles had sought to annihilate, human ingenuity and courage had persevered. The river's legacy became both practical and psychological. Soldiers spoke of the hands beneath the water, of shadows that seemed alive, of whispers in the ice. These tales were no longer merely superstition. They were part of the collective consciousness, reinforcing caution, respect, and disciplined crossing practices. Troops treated the river as a sentient partner, unpredictable, deadly, but navigable when strategy was applied. The ghostly echoes persisted, a reminder that even survival demanded reverence. Logistical analysis confirmed the effectiveness of adaptation. Out of approximately 30 to 50 vessels launched each night, survival rates improved measurably by late November. Commanders coordinated launches with artillery lulls, synchronized ore teams, and used camouflage and decoy rafts to distract German gunners. Casualty rates, though still tragic, decreased incrementally, allowing the 62nd Army to establish a continuous flow of men and materiel into Stalingrad. Success was now quantifiable, reinforcing morale and strategic capability. Yet the human cost was undeniable. Thousands of bodies floated downstream, ice trapped the dead beneath frozen surfaces, and countless others vanished without record. Survivors bore the memory of flares reflecting off floating corpses, hands brushing the hulls of rafts, and voices whispering from beneath the water. Psychological trauma was pervasive, a silent companion to those who had endured the crossings. For many, the hidden fear persisted long after the artillery fell silent, a reminder that survival carried its own burden. The city itself was transformed. Where once the factories had been gutted and streets obliterated, the 62nd Army now held key positions in preparation for the next phase. Barricades strengthened, sniper nests established, and supply points reinforced. Every reinforcement delivered across the Volga enabled tactical decisions that had previously been impossible. Soldiers could now consolidate gains, protect wounded comrades, and resist German advances with greater cohesion. The river had been an adversary, a challenge, and now an indispensable enabler. Commanders recognized the psychological edge gained. Soldiers' confidence in their own endurance and skill grew. The legend of the river, the hungry, devouring Volga, became both a caution and a symbol of resilience. Even officers noted that the ghostly stories whispered among men reinforced discipline, caution, and meticulous adherence to crossing protocols. Folklore had become strategy. Meanwhile, German command struggled to comprehend the change. Losses from failed attempts to intercept crossings, miscalculations in artillery targeting, and the persistent arrival of reinforcements undermined confidence. Reports described their frustration. The river that should have delivered annihilation had become a conduit for resistance. The Volga, ever lethal, had become unpredictable, shaped as much by human ingenuity as by its own currents. By December, the crossings continued, but with higher efficiency. Soldiers now navigated the river with understanding of currents, timing, and enemy patterns. Casualty ratios stabilized. Reinforcements arrived in sufficient numbers to hold defensive positions. The eastern bank, though battered and scarred, was a fortified anchor. The Volga had devoured the brave, but it had also delivered them. The hidden fear, though still whispered, had been transformed into calculated respect, a measure of both human courage and adaptability. Even as winter closed over the river ice, forming thick sheets above unseen corpses, the lessons endured. Every crossing had been a negotiation with death, a confrontation with elemental forces, a test of discipline, endurance, and ingenuity. The surviving soldiers carried memories of flares, floating bodies, whispers beneath oil and ice, and the sensation of a river that seemed alive. These memories became the living history of Stalingrad, whispered in bunkers, inscribed in diaries, and recorded in operational reports. In the aftermath of these crossings, the strategic impact was undeniable. Stalingrad remained a fortress, held not only by numbers and firepower, but by the human capacity to endure, adapt, and outmaneuver overwhelming danger. The river, once feared as an unstoppable devourer, had been partially tamed, harnessed, and incorporated into the city's defense. It was still lethal, still a psychological tormentor, still the source of legend, but now it was also a lifeline, a conduit for resistance, and a measure of human resilience under the most extreme conditions. And so the turn came. The Volga had claimed lives, tested courage, and nurtured terror, yet from its depths it had also delivered survival strategy and hope. Soldiers emerged exhausted and bloodied to hold positions, organize defenses, and continue the fight. The hidden fear persisted in whispers, in shadows, beneath ice, in tales passed between men. But the city endured. Stalingrad had survived in part because the brave had faced the river, learned from it, adapted, and turned its peril into a tool of defiance. The echoes remained. Bodies frozen beneath ice, floating debris, whispers in the wind, shadows under oil-streaked water, all reminders that survival carried memory. The river had devoured the brave, but the brave had also endured, leaving behind not just legends, but the reality of Stalingrad's resistance. The city's heartbeat continued in factories, ruins, and frozen streets, sustained by those who had dared. The river survived its test and carried forward the hidden fear as both warning and inspiration. The Volga River remains black and patient, flowing through Stalingrad, as it has for centuries. It carries with it both memory and silence, a witness to the thousands who crossed under fire, under flares, under the icy, indifferent current. The city itself bears the scars, factories, shattered streets, twisted rubble piled high, but the river, unchanged in its course, is a living record of fear, endurance, and survival. Among the survivors' stories were passed quietly. Some spoke of hands beneath the water, of ghostly faces, in oil-streaked currents, of whispers heard on still nights when the wind shifted. Diaries and letters recount frozen limbs, flares reflecting on waves of debris, and comrades lost to both gunfire and the river's unseen grip. These personal accounts, preserved in archives, provide a direct window into the human experience. Fear made tangible, courage made necessary. Artifacts remain helmets, retrieved from the river oars splintered under artillery fire. Life jackets with names stitched into the canvas, and journals detailing night crossings. Museums in Volgograd and Russian military archives house remnants of barges, frozen clothing, and maps showing the perilous paths across the Volga. These objects speak of survival strategy and horror alike, tangible remnants of a river that tested the brave. Operational reports, long classified, reveal the staggering numbers. Tens of thousands crossed the Volga during the siege. Thousands were lost to drowning, hypothermia, artillery, and airstrikes. Yet each crossing that succeeded delivered not just soldiers, but hope, weapons, and the backbone of resistance. The data contrasts sharply with folklore, the river's shadows, the whispered voices, the hands that seemed to reach from beneath the surface. Fact and legend intertwine, creating a complex narrative of human endurance against a river that seemed alive. Historians studying the campaign note that the crossings were critical to Stalingrad's survival. Without them, the city would have fallen faster, altering the course of the Eastern Front. Yet they also recognize the psychological weight, the hidden fear that each soldier carried, the mental toll of facing the Volga night after night, the whispers of ghosts beneath oil and ice. These intangible burdens, though impossible to quantify, were as real as the frozen bodies and splintered rafts. Local folklore preserves these echoes as well. Residents tell of nights when the wind shifts and the river murmurs, carrying faint cries or indistinct voices. Tour guides recount how soldiers swore they saw shadows beneath the ice, or glimpsed pale faces staring from the depths. These stories, once dismissed as superstition, are now studied as part of the cultural memory of Stalingrad, a testament to both the human imagination and the trauma endured. The river itself, of course, continues in silence. Currents flow past new bridges, past restored streets, past buildings rebuilt from the ashes of war. Yet beneath its surface, traces of the past remain. Helmets, rifles, personal effects, fragments of boats, the Volga carries them onward, a floating repository of history. Every crossing was a confrontation with mortality. Every ripple a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. For those who survived, memory is both relief and burden. Veterans recounted the horror, the bravery, and the thin line separating life from oblivion. Some never spoke of the hands beneath the water. Others could not forget them. In letters home and interviews decades later, the survivors described the river not as a simple body of water, but as a force testing their courage, shaping their actions, and leaving an indelible mark on the human psyche. Today, historians, scholars, and visitors continue to study the crossings, piecing together tactical maps, weather reports, Luftwaffe flight records, and artillery logs. Yet the river's hidden fear cannot be fully captured in numbers. It is found in the silence of the ice, in the ripple of water beneath a foggy dawn, in the shadow of a raft moving against the current. It lives in the combination of fact and folklore, a haunting that persists long after guns have fallen silent. As the Volga flows onward, so too does the story of those who crossed it. The city endured because men faced impossible odds, because courage met horror, and because the river, in its relentless impartiality, became a crucible that forged survival from desperation. The hidden fear remains in archives, in artifacts, in whispered legend, a testament to both human fragility and resilience. What if they had underestimated the river? What if the hands beneath the water had claimed more than they did? These questions linger unanswerable, hovering over the currents, reminders that history is shaped as much by fear and endurance as by strategy and numbers. Next, we will explore how the survivors of Stalingrad carried these memories forward, how the city rebuilt itself, and how the river continues to flow silent, witness to the bravery and terror of those nights. The Volga's current persists, carrying the echoes of the brave, the lost, and the hidden fear that has defined Stalingrad's enduring story. Its surface glimmers with the reflection of history. The convergence of fact, folklore, courage, and memory forever. A river that devours, yet forever, a river that witnesses.